Okay, let's begin. I'm keeping my eye on who's coming in at the same time.
Oh, I see that Chemtov Joshua, my old Facebook friend, is here. Chemtov, good to see you finally.
Well, terrific. So let's begin. We'll start. Welcome to this very special webinar. My name is Dr. Stephen Sussman, and I am an associate professor of public administration and the associate dean in the School of Business at Barry University in Miami. And I'm co-founder of the Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research. Dr. Luis Fleischman and I, along with a team of dedicated colleagues, created and established the center as an outlet for the marketplace of ideas. If you are on our mailing list and or social media, you know the quality of research we provide and the stellar researchers, authors, and academics who choose to align themselves with the center. The center is a nonpartisan public policy organization, a research center, and a think tank. We are a gathering of scholars, experts, and community stakeholders engaged in research and dialogue in an effort to create practical policy recommendations to current local, national, and international challenges. Therefore, the center encourages discussion and research from multiple perspectives. We believe that good policy is the result of reasonable dialogue and healthy debate, the marketplace of ideas. Thus, through publishing balanced articles and community engagement, the center aspires to provide a platform for critical thinking, analysis, and ideas to confront the challenges that affect our world. So please visit our website and sign up for our newsletter at palmbeachdemocracy.org. And if our work inspires you and informs you, please click on the donation button. We are a 501c3. Today's event, and let someone in 1 second, okay. Today's event is truly an excellent example of why the center exists. The Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research invites you to this timely discussion titled Israel and Turkey Relations, Regional Challenges. We are so honored to have three distinguished guest panelists, Dr. Robert Rabiel, Dr. Joseph Olmert, and Dr. Luis Fleischman. I'll say a few words about each of them. However, we are here for a limited time and I want to give the panelists sufficient time to speak, and certainly I want to give all of you sufficient time to ask questions. During the presentation, please use the chat box to submit questions and comments. You can also email your questions to me at shim613@gmail. That's shim613@gmail.com. And of course, if time permits, you may be able to ask live questions. Dr. Robert Rabiel is a professor of political science at Florida Atlantic University. He earned his doctorate in Near Eastern and Judaic studies from Brandeis. His areas of studies and expertise include, but are not limited to, political Islam, terrorism, US-Arab relations, Arab-Israeli conflict, US-Muslim relations, and contemporary Middle East politics. He is the author of dozens of articles in major academic and professional journals. Dr. Joseph Olmert is a top Middle East scholar, former peace negotiator, much published author and journalist. He is currently an adjunct professor of political science at the University of South Carolina. Prior to this, he had an international academic teaching career in Israel, Canada, and the United States, where he taught at City College of New York, Cornell, and American University. In Israel, he headed the Syria and Lebanon desks at Tel Aviv University's Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies, where he served on the faculty. And Dr. Luis Fleischman is a professor of sociology at Palm Beach State College. He earned his doctorate from the New School for Social Research. For many years, he served as vice president of the Jewish Community Relations Council at the Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County, where he built lasting relationships between the Jewish community and the diverse South Florida communities. He is a Middle East expert, as evidenced in his latest book, The Middle East Riddle, The Peace Process and Arab-Israeli Relations in Changing Times. Not only are we honored to have such distinguished panelists, it should be noted that all three are senior fellows here at the center, and Luis, of course, is co-founder. Now, to begin, I turn this over to Dr. Rabil, who will do his presentation. Each presentation will be about 10 minutes, and then we'll have questions. Dr. Rabil.
Thank you, Stephen. First, let me say, I really thank you. It's my pleasure and honor to be invited by the Palm Beach Center. And it's doubly so to be in the company of Yossi and Louis, a very good friend and what a great colleagues and scholars. Well, let me take you on a small journey, on a short journey about Israel-Turkish relations, and I will add a few opinions at the end. Something about Turkey as a Muslim majority country in the Middle East and a major Muslim majority country. It really recognized Israel in 1949. That was the first country, Muslim, and I would say it had a good relationship with Israel, as Israel pursued at the time, 1950, 1960, what is called a peripheral policy, focusing on Iran and focusing on Turkey. In the 1960s, you still have a good relationship, but in the 1960s and 1970s, Turkey decided to pursue, according to Turkish perspective, what is called a benevolent relationship, in the Middle East, mainly to go, to approach to the Arabs, but also not to alienate Israel. In 1967, for example, they didn't side with the Arabs, but they didn't side with the Israelis. And as a matter of fact, they called for Israel to withdraw, from the areas that Israel took in the 1967 war. Now, in the 1970s, again, I have to say something. During the war, the Yom Kippur War, Turkey did not allow United States to use its bases. It's extremely important. And in 1967, so. And somehow it wanted to further its rapprochement with the Arabs. It needed trades. It started to look at, somehow at the Palestinians. It really espoused a position that the Palestinians, they need their self-determination, but also at the same time, they tried hard not to alienate Israel. Now, something happened in 1975. In 1975, they voted in United Nations to equate Zionism with racism. That did not sit well with the Israelis, but still, I would say this relationship continued until the 1980s. 1980s and early 90s, something happened there where really Turkey was not very happy with the Arabs. And I'll tell you why it was not happy with the Arabs. The Arabs, and really it tried a rapprochement with them. The Arabs did not support the Bulgarian Turks. Extremely important, late 80s, early 90s. And they said, what's going on here? And the Arabs did not support Turkish policy in Cyprus. These are two important things that said, what's going on here? I'm supporting you, I am siding with you, and I am seeing nothing in return. So this is where I think myself, you started to have somehow a better relationship with Israel. And something also I would like to highlight, since I was serving in the Red Cross in Lebanon, and I know about it. When Israel invaded Lebanon, Turkey wanted to have some information, on Asala, the Armenian radical, and on the PKK. And Israel provided this information. So my point is, despite some kind of little up and downs, you still have relationship. And I think when it comes to the intelligence cooperation, sharing some information, I always believe that those two countries, regardless of who's on top, they shared certain information, extremely important. Now, come 1990 again, this is where you have, as I mentioned, Turkey was not very happy with the Arabs. You have a new leadership. And this is what we see, the peak of Israel-Turkish relationship and the signings of very important agreements. As a matter of fact, strategic cooperation now. Israel could fly over Turkish space, Turkey, better trade, and especially sharing military information better arms, trading. So this is what I see, is that Turkey and Israel grounded themselves in a strategic cooperation. And this lasted until 2002. 2002, you had the AKP and you have Erdogan. Erdogan really, he, as an Islamist, he doesn't have really that much love for Israel. Let's be honest about it. But also Erdogan, when I look at him and I see him, he's a pragmatist. So really he wanted to, and especially when his foreign minister, issued, the strategic doctrine, mainly to go ahead, and have a zero conflict in the Middle East, a better cooperation with all countries, So this is where, Erdogan started to go ahead and felt happy in that he was able to communicate with the Arabs, to communicate with the Muslims, and this is where he started more or less being very critical of Israel and against how they treated the Palestinians. And I would say, Marmara came, when Gaza, when some people, they wanted to break the siege of Gaza, and you have the Marmara ship. That was in 2010. That was a very low point in the relationship between Israel and Turkey. And let's not forget, Israel, when it stormed the ship, you have 8 people that died then, and then one died after. So this is where Erdogan now became extremely, angry with Israel. And I would say from that time onwards, especially, when you had the Gaza war, and the Gaza in 2016, 2018, when they wanted to break, the blockade. This is where he was really fanning a lot of anti-Israel material, anti-Israel feeling, really, from all counts. And of course, with Trump, when Trump recognized Jerusalem, he was one of the main one who said, no, how could they recognize Jerusalem? Jerusalem is for us. I'm going to defend the Palestinians. And more so. And also, I would like to add here that Netanyahu and Erdogan really butted heads more than once, really more than once. And then you have the 2016, 2018, again, tension with Gaza, and again, fanning. So mainly he has been fanning very much anti-Islamic feeling, but also at the same time, and this is very important, when I look at the trade between Israel and Turkey, the trade kept going up. It's between $5 billion to $6 billion a year. So despite all this, anti-Israeli feeling, and the Israeli really were not happy with them, really. So, but still the trade was there, the trade was there. Then under Trump, as I mentioned, with the recognition of Jerusalem, he was against, unhappy. And then we see recently, what we see recently we see the Abraham Accord, and we see the Azerbaijan war. With the Azeri war, as a matter of fact, we see that Turkey and Israel together, although I would say not necessarily cooperating with each other, but they were together in supporting the Azeri. So this is where you have a common interest. Also, I will say after, because Israel now is worried about Turkish influence in Azerbaijan, where Israel today really has a very good relationship with the Azeri. And the other thing are the Abraham Accord. The Abraham Accord really, Erdogan was unhappy with them. He blamed United Arab Emirates. He was very critical of Israel, UAE, and very critical. But then, as a matter of fact, in the last few months, I will say 6 months ago, he started to give certain, feelings to Israel. I'm going to return the Israeli ambassador. Also, they chose one, I believe, Yossi know about him. He was a student at the Hebrew University, although he was more pro-Palestinians, but he speaks Hebrew, this and that. And more so now, we see that he is ready. His spokesperson went to Brussels. He spoke, I am ready to have a warm relationship with Israel. So really, he's sending feelings toward Israel. And I believe that the Israelis, they met, including the military, and they discussed. And here you have, I think myself, you have certain issues that Turkey and Israel would like to kind of negotiate. And here, let me tell you the concerns, really. First, the concern that Turkey, and it was a point of tension, the Mediterranean basin. Israel was able to go and have certain agreements with Egypt, Cyprus, and Greece. Greece, let's not forget, Greece historically has been pro-Palestinian, but now you have a kind of whole change in that geostrategic relationship between Greece and Israel. So Turkey was not happy with that, and Turkey established a base in Libya, and Turkey supported some Libyans. And at one time, there was kind of a tension in the sea between an Israeli ship and a Turkish ship. So this is where, you know, this is one tension. And the second tension that could be an area of negotiation. And the second one is Iran. You know, through Turkey, you know, speaks with Iran. You know, they have the Astana process, you know, regarding Syria. They are most of them party to it. But still you have this tension, and this is where Israel, you know, is really I would say, studying its move vis-a-vis Turkey. And Turkey, again, now today, it doesn't have that much trade. You know, really, its economy is not doing well. Domestically, is not doing that great. And really, they would like to kind of beef up their trade. And more so, they have two issues now that happen, extremely important. First, Trump is gone. Trump really had a good relationship with Erdogan. He gave him the go-ahead to go into Syria. Now you have Biden. Biden and his people, they are going to be more kind of paying more attention to Turkish violation of human rights, and especially in Syria and inside Turkey, vis-a-vis the Kurds. And I think Erdogan is kind of worried. And I believe, and mainly, of course, what I hear and what you read, is that he really would like to have now a warmer relationship with Israel, so Israel could help him with Biden, or at least the supporters of Israel in the United States could help him, you know, with Biden. You know, and the other issue also, you know, as I mentioned, you know, the Mediterranean basin, you know, and Iran. Now, there is other also things that that Israel, from Israel perspective, you know, and this is where the test is going to be, you know, mainly regarding Hamas and regarding the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, this is where Israel worried, and based on the little I know, I believe Yossi will know more, or Lewis will know more. You know, Erdogan, through his spokesperson, sent feelings through some European countries to Israel. He said he's going to tone down, you know, his vocal, you know, the way he speaks about the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, and more so, he's not gonna allow them to be as active as before. So this is where now this is a variable, and this is an extremely important variable for Israel. So mainly, if I put together the push forces and the pull forces, you know, from the pull forces, you have trade. Trade really is really good between the two countries, despite, you know, the low points. Second, you have arms. You have really, they reciprocate, and Turkey needs Israeli arms and technology. You have the Eastern Mediterranean basin, you know, and you have the Biden administration. So these are the pull forces that I think that the two, and Iran to a certain extent, were the two countries really that would like to have, you know, some kind of a common objective, or at least work together. Now, the push forces are Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood, and what Turkey is doing in Syria, and how is that relationship between Turkey, Syria versus Israel, Russia in Syria. So these are the pull forces. But let me end with this. When I look at it from the pattern, who needs more? First, up until 2000, I would say Israel needed more Turkey than Turkey needed Israel. Today, you know, the table has shifted, you know. Today, Turkey needs Israel more than Israel needs Turkey. Israel today is going to start to have a great relationship with some Arab countries. It have dealings again with Egypt and Greece. So really, Israel today sits way better geostrategically than ever before. So I think Israel, in its relationship now with Turkey, is going to be suspicious. So you are not going to have a fast warming of relation. You have now a component of suspicion vis-a-vis Turkey, and especially when I speak about Turkey, vis-a-vis the leader of the AKP of Erdogan. Meaning, what does it mean? What does that translate to? That this translate, the way I see it, into a slowing of warming relationship, to see, for Israel to see how Turkey is going to deal with, especially Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood, and Iran. And of course, a question variable, worrying, a concern about what's the impact of Turkish relationship of Turkey with Azerbaijan on Israeli-Azerbaijan relations. So this is where I ended. You have a strong component of suspicion, and I will give my floor to Yossi or to Lewis, to add to what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rabiel. Dr. Olmert,
Yeah.
you're up.
Thank you very much. And let me start again, as I always do in these meetings, to say that these two guys, Fleischmann and Zassman, the two great professors, you really have done something very good, very important. Guys that listen to us, you have no idea how fearful some of us in the academic community are, not because of being Jewish or because of being pro-Israel, but because of the creeping atmosphere of McCarthyism that is entering into the American academic community. And therefore, any institution like the one that was established by the professors who are good friends of mine, Fleischmann and Zassman, Louis and Stephen, is so significant because it really is important that we understand that the atmosphere is becoming very tense, very nervous, and not so simple as it used to be, or as we would have expected it to be, because this is America. Having said that, I always say to myself after listening to Robert Rabiel, what else can I say? I mean, Robert said everything, and he's so brilliant. I don't like to repeat what Robert said because it will take away from his greatness, but I will still have a point in contention with Robert, as we will see towards the end of my short presentation. When I wrote this article about Israel and Turkey that was published by the Center, I referred a lot to the history of the Israeli-Turkish relations, going all the way back to the Ottoman Empire, including also elements concerning with the personality of Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey and his Jewish connection, yes or no, but please the rich literature about this. And the reason that I did it was because I think that when we look at issues in the Middle East, whether this particular issue or any other of those, we can never get into the immediate situation as if there is no legacy of the past and heritage of historic narratives and all that. And this is interesting because there is an historic narrative between Israel and Turkey. And if you want, just a few years ago, the Erdogan government, as part of its anti-Israel policy, gave the Palestinian Authority what they call the treasure, over 140,000 documents from the Ottoman Empire that are intended to allow the Palestinian Authority to come up with demands from Israel about properties and locations and land possession in Israel and in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank. So even though it may not be the most important element of the story that we are telling here, it is an interesting something that indicates to you the complexity of all these relations. Now let me move on to the more immediate situation. I would say the following. Look, Erdogan is not a nice guy, and he's semi-dictator, and he's an Islamist, and all this is very true. I mean, there's no question about that. So any relations with him, and this is a point that Louis made, which triggered this discussion because I took issue with him, have to do with the fact that Israel should always ask itself the question as to how much can we be in bed, so to speak, with people like Erdogan, with semi-dictators or full dictators. The question is how we look at it. And that's a moral question. I mean, it's something that I also ask myself about, say, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. What side should be in terms of historic legacies and all that. And of course, when it comes to Turkey and Azerbaijan and Armenia, it is the Armenian genocide. But look, the fact of the matter is that we in Israel are not in a position where we can be the arbiters and the judges of the morality of every other nation around us and make it the one and only or the most important criteria by which to advance relations. Because look at Egypt, is al-Sisi a nice guy? No, he's not, he's a dictator. Look at the Saudis, look at the UAE, look at Bahrain. Are they nice guys the way we understand it to be in the Western world? No, they are not. Look at Sadat when he came to Jerusalem. Sadat was in a Nazi espionage ring in the Second World War. He was in a British jail. And he talked about Jews like whatever. And he made peace with us. So let's be honest about that. Erdogan is far from being the favorite son that we would like to see, but he is the leader of Turkey. And that brings me to the second point of, look, Turkey is 80 plus million people. It's an important country, strategically located with a GDP of about $1 trillion a year, much less per capita than Israel, but still $1 trillion. They are members of the G20. They are a definitely important country from a variety of perspectives. By the way, one of the largest military forces in the world, I think the largest in NATO after the US, with a standing army of about 1 million people. And with still constituent groups in Turkey itself, which are definitely not anti-Israel or hostile to Israel. And this is one of the points which, coming back to what Robert told us in the 1990s, and by the way, in the first 5 to 7 years of the 21st century, the relations with Turkey were almost like a strategic alliance because of the significant support of the Turkish military and elements in Turkish society that can be considered more liberal, more democratic, less Islamist. Erdogan visited Israel. The president of Turkey visited Israel at that time. You know, we should not forget it. Just to say, even today, according to polls in Turkey, only, okay, it's a lot, but 60% of the Turks don't like Israel. I mean, it's not 100%, you know. So we definitely have people in Turkey that could be a basis for better relations in the future if we come to that point. So again, let's remember, Turkey is an important player in Middle East politics, and we have to bear this in mind, which leads me to the third point. Israel, and Robert is so right about that, and I'm so happy that he made the point. It's Turkey that is courting Israel now, not the other way around. That is to say, it is a recognition by one of the most important countries of the Middle East, a significant member of NATO, that Israel has become something else in Middle East politics. We are not the bogey person of Middle East politics anymore. We are not the hated odd man out. We are within the system of Middle East relations. And exactly because of that, Turkey wants to have a change of relations with Israel, because they realize that until now, the anti-Israel policies of Erdogan did not win friends for Turkey in the Arab world. Look, that's an interesting point that we have to make. To be anti-Israel today is not enough in order to be friendly with the Arabs. Maybe on the contrary. So let's remember this point as well, you know. And if Erdogan in his own clumsy and rough way is realizing that this is the situation, let him grapple with it. Let him not decide too quickly that we are not interested at all. Let him deal with it. Let him see how it develops. Now, the fourth point is, and that again, interesting to make, you know, some of you may know I'm not exactly a fan of Netanyahu for all kinds of reasons, but make no mistake about it. Netanyahu did do things that are influential on Turkish position now. He created the Balkan alliance of Israel, Bulgaria, Serbia, Croatia, Romania, even Kosovo under the auspices of President Trump. They are all very friendly with Israel. These are all, and Bosnia. These are all countries that were supposed to be part of the Erdogan network as he tried to develop way back, you know. And don't forget Greece and Cyprus. And I will tell you about Greece and Cyprus without getting into details, and please don't ask me about that. The relations between Israel and Greece and Cyprus are much more than what catches the eye. They are strategic, they are military, and they are highly significant to Israel. And Erdogan is aware of that. Erdogan knows that. And these are all achievements of Israeli foreign policy in the last 10 or so years that were done when Netanyahu was the prime minister. So we have to say that as well. Now it brings me to another point, and this is the American factor of all that. That will be the point before last in my presentation. I think that we all are waiting to the unfolding of Biden's foreign policy, and in particular, that context, the Middle East policy. And as much as we think that we know what exactly will be the policy, I would advise us all not to be so sure about that. I heard what James Psaki, I don't know if I pronounced her name properly, said about the Iran nuclear deal in her first briefing. It was a very vague, interesting statement that gives me hope that we can do more business with Biden than what some Israelis and friends of Israel think. But here is the point that I want to make. We need to show to the Biden administration exactly what I've just said to you until now. Israel is no more a troublemaker in the context of the Middle East. Israel is an asset. Israel is in touch with Arab countries. Israel can also be in touch even with a country like Turkey. Israel is in touch with the envelope countries around, Cyprus, Greece, in the Balkans. Israel is in good relations with Russia. We have a lot to offer to the Biden administration other than just complaining all the time about don't do this and don't do that. And I think that it is important that we realize that we are in a situation like that where we can tell American administration that may be less friendly than the previous one, hey, look, we are not the classic usual troublemakers who come around and beg for your support and assistance. We can also offer you something back. And therefore, relations between us and Turkey are important because if we can help with our friends in the Senate, in the Congress, and we still have many of them, in terms of the American-Turkish relations, it won't do bad. And that's exactly what Erdogan thinks about us. So why do we have to frustrate him to believe that we don't have all these channels of communication and influence? On the contrary, we should do it. It's good for our policy. And that brings me to Iran. Erdogan doesn't like Iran. This is Sunni Islam versus Shia Islam. Iran, Persia was the only country in the Middle East never to be occupied by the Ottomans. It's an important historic fact, you know. And in the case of Syria, and that's my only bone of contention with what Robert said, we have a common interest with Turkey, not the other way around. Both of us do not want to see Iran having too much of a foothold in Syria. And whereas the Turks are concentrating their efforts in the northern part of Syria, we have an interest in the southern part of Syria, which I don't think is contradictory to what the Turks view about the future of Syria. So the bottom line of all that is, yes, we have to make sure that Hamas activities will be curtailed. By the way, they started doing it. I mean, Aruri, the leader of Hamas, the number 2 of Hamas, was basically expelled from Turkey, even though they still have an office in Istanbul, which in Ankara. We need to take care of all this. I don't know what Erdogan will do or not about Hamas. That remains to be seen. The trade is very significant. As Robert said, it's $5 billion. And it reflects, by the way, the interests of important groups in Turkey that happen to be supporters of Erdogan, the agricultural community and some elements of the business community. So there's no need not to keep promoting these relations. And definitely we need to make sure that if we go ahead with the pipeline project with Cyprus and Greece, the Turks might be persuaded to join it rather than disrupt it. So all these issues are still there and we have to check them very carefully, to look at them very carefully. I agree with Robert in that sense. We don't need to rush into that. But I would not be the one to tell you that we should not promote relations with Turkey. I would definitely say, as a bottom line, it is important for Israel to be friendly with Turkey. Let's give it a chance. Let's be positive about that, and let's see how it develops. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Olmert. Wise words, of course. Luis, Dr. Fleischman, you are up.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much. Well, first of all, let me tell you, I asked to be the last speaker because I knew that Robert and Yossi were going to cover most of the stuff. They are the real experts. I am not. I am not an expert on the Middle East, and I'm not.
What are you talking about? You're an expert on everything. Come on.
No. And I'm not an expert on Latin America. That's the reality. I am a sociologist, a political sociologist, and a sociologist of international relations, if you wish. So therefore, I would like just to emphasize some things, and I agree with everything that Robert and Yossi actually pointed out, and really it was brilliant. I have nothing to add, except a few things that I want to point out, I mean, from my angle. In 2013, the scholar of Turkey, Soner Çapgay, that many of you probably heard him speak, or maybe you read his articles, because he's a scholar in the Washington Institute for Middle East Policy, and probably for Near East Policy, and probably one of the most, probably one of the greatest scholars on Turkey. And in 2013, he wrote that book called The New Turkey, where he basically viewed Turkey as a sort of economic power that would evolve into a democratic state with religious tolerance. To a certain extent, he saw in Erdogan's Party of Justice and Development a sort of Christian democracy, right? Economic prosperity, religious tolerance could serve also as a model for the new emerging societies, Arab societies that actually emerged after the Arab Spring. By the way, President Barack Obama shared the same view. However, as things evolved, we have seen that, first of all, Turkey was prosperous in the beginning, not so much now. It turned to be not democratic, but increasingly authoritarian, and also an Islamist, an intolerant state, and state that has become basically, even in foreign policy, an ally of radical elements. I agree with Robert when he said that Erdogan is a pragmatist, but he's a combination of both. He's an ideologue, and when it is convenient, he's a pragmatist. And I think that is probably gives a little bit of the background of why he's looking to somehow normalize or reset the relation with Israel. Now, very interesting, and that was mentioned by Robert and by Yossi, Erdogan began his foreign policy with the notion that Turkey is destined to be a great power, right? First of all, I would say, like every dictator that is a revolutionary dictator, and I basically put Erdogan in the category of a revolutionary dictator. That means he's not only a dictator that is trying to impose law and order, but he's also a dictator that has an ideology and is trying to, or at least in the beginning, try to revolutionize the country. So in foreign policy, one of the images that Erdogan actually brought was Ottomanism, this nostalgia for this glorified past. And you can see that the doctrine, the foreign policy doctrine that they developed, that actually Robert alluded to it, that says, well, we, Turkey, are not going to be just merely trying to accommodate to the world and try to get into the European Union, but we are going to be more than that. We are going to be a superpower. We are going to be a global power. And then you have this doctrine, which was developed by Ahmed Davutoglu, a former foreign minister and also prime minister, that Turkey needed to be deeper involved in the Middle East and in the Balkans, all right? And this explains some of the aggressive policies that actually Turkey developed, like, for instance, its external engagements in Libya and Syria, right? Involvement in open military bases in Qatar and Somalia, right? It deployed troops in Libya. It provided training in Sudan, and not the new Sudan, the Sudan of Bashir, okay? And of course, as you know, supported also Sunni militia groups in Syria, right? Not to speak about production of weapons, another thing. So Turkey basically was portraying itself, or was coming up, emerging as what is called a power, and a power that actually looked to influence the world beyond. This dream actually still exists. And let me see if I can quote from Erdogan. in February 2020, he said something like that. February 2020, we are talking about a year ago. Erdogan said, within half a century, Turkey will emerge as one of the strongest powers of the world, sailing into larger accomplishments. Okay, so interesting, like I would say, like every dictatorship, all right? Usually revolutionary dictators actually dream high, and sometimes they don't understand their own limitations, right? And I'll give you an example. Erdogan tried to exercise leadership in the Arab world by breaking the tradition, you know, this traditional relation with Israel, this strategic relation that Yossi and Robert spoke about. So we had the incidents of the Mavi Marmara that, you know, Robert mentioned, support for Hamas, right? The famous fight between Erdogan and Shimon Peres when he challenged Shimon Peres and he called him a murderer, basically. Erdogan, as Yossi pointed out, Erdogan sought to ingratiate with the Arab world by trashing Israel, but he did not understand that a new coalition between Israel and the Arab Sunni countries was emerging in order to counterbalance the power of Iran in the region. So in that sense, Erdogan totally miscalculated, and as a result, basically he failed on that part. Turkey today is no way has any hegemony or any influence in the Middle East that is hegemonic, that is dominant, right? As an example, you know, he tried to mingle in Syria and eventually didn't do much. At one point, Turkey aspired to basically to unseat, to replace Saudi Arabia as the leader of the Muslim world. And also, Turkey, as somebody mentioned, fueled the fight between Armenia and Azerbaijan by supporting Azerbaijan. This is something that, of course, they share with Israel, even though Israel did not support directly Azerbaijan in the same way that Turkey did. It was more indirectly, but helping modernize the army and the military and so on and so forth. And Turkey started to participate in proxy wars in Somalia, Syria, and Libya. I already mentioned that. Now, Islamists seem to be a natural ally for Turkey, and I mentioned alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood, alliance with the, you know, with Hamas, alliance with Qatar, right? But all these actually brought about a lot of conflicts, right? And one is the European Union. The European Union not happy with the attitude of Turkey, particularly the human rights. Turkey later bought this anti-aircraft system from Russians, the S-400, right? Which also raised concern. There was a feeling that Turkey, as being one of the most powerful armies or military in NATO, was basically moving the other way around. Turkey became a protege, basically, of the Russians. In other words, move toward the Russian sphere of influence, if you wish. And the way I see the world today is that Russia, of course, aspires to be a world power or recover its status as a world power by basically looking at the world and the relation with the United States as a zero-sum game. So they co-opted Turkey. And up to the point that, particularly after the attempt at coup d'etat that took place in July 2016, I believe, up to the point that Turkey basically went to as far as Venezuela and tried to cut a deal between the opposition and the government. But basically, Turkey became an ally of Venezuela, which is a rogue state that is basically within the Russian sphere of influence. Now, Russia's aggressiveness, of course, and that was mentioned also by Robert and Yossi, expanded to the Eastern Mediterranean, right? He sees, you know, Turkey actually signed an agreement with the government of the National Accord in Libya, they actually released a plan for drilling gas and oils in areas that actually Greece regards as their waters, right? In other words, Turkey became very aggressive in trying to dominate the so-called blue homeland. In other words, trying to catch as much sea as possible, if you wish, in the Mediterranean. And as a result, basically what you have as a result is an alliance between Greece and Egypt that later expanded to a so-called anti-Turkish axis in the Middle East that includes Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, and Israel. And it is supported by France and now also by the United Arab Emirates. And the struggle in the Eastern Mediterranean, and I think Robert alluded to that, is over the development of energy resources, but also is a strategic struggle. Is part of this idea, this strategic strategy of Turkey. Now, what happens is that with the intervention in Turkey, not to speak about, you know, the crackdown on the Kurds in Syria, Turkey became more and more isolated because it became in direct confrontation with the majority of the countries in the Middle East. All right. Turkey created multiple enemies and became more and more isolated. And this is when actually the Russians basically offered Turkey their protection, but at the same time, Russia became so dominant in Syria that undermined the role that Erdogan wanted to play in Syria. That shows you how imaginary or how unrealistic were all these foreign policy dreams of the Turks. Now, I believe that this diet isolation that actually makes Turkey into now moving Erdogan into a more pragmatist position, which is what actually Robert alluded to, partly because he knows that Biden is not particularly sympathetic to Turkey, you know, the opposite. They even, the new Secretary of State, Blinken, and also Sullivan, the Director of National Security, they spoke about exercising some tough love on Russia. They are not happy with the way in which Turkey's authoritarianism is going, and they are not happy also with their foreign policy, and certainly not happy with the hostility toward Israel. So to a certain extent, what we are seeing is Turkey trying to more or less be in good terms with the United States under Biden, knowing that Biden may confront Turkey. Now, this is, I would say, and here is where I support Yossi's argument. This could be good news. If Turkey is willing to move to the American sphere again, and as a result, after all the propaganda and all the bad rhetoric, and after supporting Hamas, he's trying to reset the relations with Israel, this may be good news. However, I think it is important for Israel not to fall into all the demands, not to be desperate to normalize relations with Turkey, and as a result, they would dismantle all these alliances that Israel has with Greece, Cyprus, and Egypt over the Mediterranean. You know, the East Mediterranean Gas Forum, and there are a number of agreements that have been signed there. I think Israel should say, listen, today Israel, we are a power. We are a powerhouse. That means we are not going to surrender to your demands. We are not desperate for friends. That's not the situation, like Yossi said, of the 2000s. We demand two things. First of all, we are not going to dismantle our alliances with Greece, Cyprus, and Egypt. Secondly, you have to tone down the anti-Israel rhetoric. And to a certain extent, it would be something like, don't say no to Turkey, but at the end of time, actually watch it, okay? What in Hebrew you call kabdeu v'hashdeu. The other thing, actually, that I think needs to be done is that we cannot have a situation like with Egypt. In Egypt, we had Israel had a peace agreement with Israel, but at the same time, the rhetoric was so negative, and relations between the people of Egypt and the people of Israel were not allowed to take place. I think that in the Middle East, and this is something that I say in the conclusion of my book that Steve actually mentioned, don't let governments normalize relations only. In other words, in the Middle East, I think the role of civil society is crucial. You know, cultural exchanges between Turks and Israelis, regardless of the government. You know, that's very important. Travel, more connections, commercial relations between privates in Israel and privates in Turkey. I think all these should test the relations between Israel and Turkey. And then maybe let's see how it evolves. But at this point, I would suggest to the Israelis, and I know they eventually do whatever they want to do, not to surrender to crazy demands by Erdogan, like, you know, if you see that Erdogan, if Erdogan, what he wants is to be in good terms with the Americans, great. If what Erdogan wants is for Israel to dismantle all these relations built in the Eastern Mediterranean, the answer should be no. And in addition, as I pointed out before, it's important that relations in the Middle East be developed by also elements in civil society, and that applies not only to Turkey, but also all the relations between Israel and the Arab world. Thank you.
Luis, thank you so much. Of course, very informative as always, as were all three panelists. But in the limited time we have, I'd like to jump right into the questions. We have a number of questions. And this is from Jacob Mitzner. For the panel, how do you view the appointment of Blinken? Now, you just mentioned Blinken, Luis, as Secretary of State, and Jake Sullivan as National Security Advisor. Who would like to take that?
I would say very briefly, Blinken sounds sympathetic, Sullivan less so, but you know, who we are to pass judgment on the appointments of Biden. I was afraid that Susan Rice would become the #1 in foreign policy. I was afraid that Wendy Sherman would become more senior than what apparently she's going to be, unless she will be too influential, remains to be seen. But as of now, and it is so premature, I mean, we don't really have any perspective, you know. As of now, and I'm very suspicious about the Biden administration, they haven't given me at least any reason to lose sleeping hours, but that remains to be seen. It's too early.
Anyone else want to take that? That's terrific. Thanks, Yossi.
Well,
go ahead, Luis.
Well, you are asking about Blinken, right? I mean, I think the Biden administration, I don't expect the Biden administration to be bad for Israel in any shape or form. I think there are some good news that are coming. I mean, first of all, and something that actually Yossi pointed out in his Facebook page, Biden actually, I think it was Blinken who said that Israel is going to be taken into account in the dealings with Iran. Something that obviously Obama took that into account, but not as much as I think as Israel wanted. So that is good news. I expect the Biden administration to continue to support normalization between Israel and individual Arab countries. And I think there is nothing to fear. If somebody thinks that the administration is going to turn against Israel or anything like that, I think they're going to be tougher in terms of the settlements. I think they are not going to go along with the Trump plan that basically enables the Israelis to annex in case the Palestinians don't come forward to the negotiations. I think Biden is definitely going to oppose, but that has been the policy of most administrations, including Republican and Democrats.
Terrific. Thank you. Robert, anything to say, or should we, or no?
As a matter of fact, I agree with Louis. The only thing going to be a difference, Trump shut the door for the Palestinian. Biden's going to open the door. I think that their mission in the United States is going to be open. I think probably and most likely, some funds are gonna go to the Palestinian like before, especially in human right and other, but also I think to the institution. Let's not forget, Democrat and Republican, they supported, the Palestinian institution. You had a huge and a lot of money was spent. So really, to maintain the economic and intelligence or military cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian, I think they're gonna go there and they're gonna push for there. I wouldn't say they're gonna push for the two come together, this and that. This is really, it has to go with the two, the Palestinian and the Israeli. But on the other hand, as I mentioned, you are going to see, tracks, the economic track, the military track, and you are going to be see more involvement, and something also with Biden, he's going to rely on multilateral approach, whether vis-a-vis Iran or vis-a-vis any country. So I would see myself, Jordan, he's gonna, for sure, he's gonna invite Jordan to have a more say, mainly to kind of calm the situation, especially in certain area in the West Bank and Gaza. And this is what I see. But other than that, I don't see that Biden's gonna be in any way anti-Israeli. Absolutely not. In any way anti-Israeli, no.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question, all three of you brought up Iran. So Tara Laxer is asking, we know the administration will not go back to the Iran deal since the reality on the ground has changed, yet Iran has further capability today. How do you see we isolate Iran in the nuclear capability under the new administration?
Well, let me just say, I think that I'm the only one of the three that knows President Biden personally. I had dinner with him in Tel Aviv way back though, but he definitely impressed me at that time. It was years ago, as being very friendly towards Israel, and he expressed interesting opinions that were borne out by realities. But that was years ago, and of course, I'm not going to have any connection with him now. I just wanted to say it, because sometimes when you see somebody in person, it gives you a different perspective. To the question of Tara, I would say very briefly that the two interesting points that were raised in recent days and before about the Iran nuclear deal were the injection of the element of the Iranian missile industry and the role of Iran in the region. These are two of the 3 points or 4 points which Israel was always opposed to. So it's interesting. I would say very briefly also, and I beg Netanyahu to put aside electioneering now. It's a hope against hope, I know, and to keep the door open for entering into a constructive dialogue with Biden about the Iran nuclear deal, to not repeat the mistake which he did in 2016 or 2015, I should say, with the Iranians, with the Obama administration at that time. And Obama was not pro-Israel, but Netanyahu made his own mistakes. The Americans would be happy for us to get into the process. And if we are into, we can influence the process more than if we are out of it.
Thank you. Anyone else have anything to say?
I will add something, if Louis, listen, there is something where I can see coming. The Biden administration is not going to pursue the maximum pressure policy. This is one thing. The Biden administration is going to pursue, as I mentioned before, a multilateral approach. Where this is, United States, it's going to negotiate, and you're going to listen to Europe. It's going to listen to Germany. It's going to listen to France. It's going to listen, to the European countries. It's going to be important. But this is where I agree also with Yossi. Things has changed a lot, and I don't think the Biden administration is going to go to the deal. If the deal, is not going to be revised to deal with the sunset laws, the missile development, and I would say less behavior. Mainly, I think myself, the two things, the missile development and the sunset laws. This is, I think that if Iran will say, okay, I'm going to revise those, I think Biden is going to go there. Regarding the region, I think that Biden, via the less maximum pressure, Iran will have more of an economy, better than now. But you have to listen now. Tell me where Iran is going to go anywhere other than Hezbollah and Iraq and Syria. Syria is broken, completely broken. The Syrian regime, I don't know if you are reading about, I believe probably Yossi know, the Syrian regime today doesn't have any money at all.
It's nominal regime. It's basically nominal.
Yeah, exactly. In Lebanon, what is Lebanon today? Lebanon is if I tell you stories, you won't listen. Is more than a failed state. And Hezbollah will not do anything to alienate more people. Probably, someday they will have to have a war in order to silence the other people. But Lebanon is a terrible situation. You go to Iraq, and I know Qadimi myself, and I mentioned that in Iraq, really, even the Shia there, they say enough. I am not saying that Iran is not going to have influence. Iran is going to get influence, but there is a limit for Iranians' projection of power, especially that today you have Israel and the Arabs and United States are there. And most also, let's not forget, the people of the region, like see the Syrian, see the Iraqi, even Iraqi inside Baghdad, they say, forget the Iranian. We are neighbor, but don't go dictate on us, like in Lebanon. So really there is a limit to the Iranians. What I worry mostly myself, as Israel will worry most, now is about the missiles. The missiles that Iran could go ahead and launch from Iraq, from Syria, and especially from Lebanon.
Well, I just, to be brief, I agree with Robert. The issue of the missiles, I think, is extremely important. And I think we saw when Iran actually attacked this installation of Aramco a couple of years ago, you could tell how, the reach of those missiles. So I think it is extremely important. The sunset also. But on the other hand, the only one thing I disagree with Robert here is that there has never been a negotiation over Iran's destabilizing activities, okay? And I don't think they are so innocent. For instance, the support for the Shiites in Iraq, these Shiite militias in Iraq, the support for the Houthis in Yemen. I know a lot of people are trashing Saudi Arabia because they say that Saudi Arabia is bombarding and bombing Yemen, but they forgot the role of Iran in basically triggering the Houthi rebellion. So not to speak about Hezbollah, and now Iran actually is moving troops, of course, in Syria, next to the Golan Heights. I believe that if you can introduce these things into a negotiation, that will be terrific. The question is whether the Iranians will agree. Unless...
But that's exactly where Netanyahu has the challenge of stop these campaigns against Biden and his people and join the process in order to try and influence from within, as opposed to what he did not do 5 or 6 years ago. That's exactly where the problem is.
Well, I agree with you 100%. Netanyahu cannot repeat what he did a few years ago by addressing the Congress that was basically under the control of the opposite party. Not a good idea. But I doubt that the Iranians will agree to stop these destabilizing activities. And I doubt that Biden will say, okay, if you don't stop this destabilizing activity, we will go back to the maximum pressure.
I'd like to...
that Biden will try to reach an agreement. The problem of Iran becoming a nuclear power is a problem, is definitely a problem. I'm not saying so. I think I spoke not a long time ago with a woman who is running a think tank that deals with nuclear issues out of Bombay, out of New Delhi, India. And she told me that if you introduce Iran's destabilizing activity into the negotiations, you're not going to get anything. You're not going to get a deal. The only way to get a nuclear deal is if basically you remove the other activities of Iran from the equation. Now, the question is, we need to decide. We prefer a deal and to stop, or at least to delay Iran's nuclear development, and we are willing to live with that, with Iran's destabilizing activities. I mean, Robert seems to think that these destabilizing activities are going nowhere. and I respect that. I have a different impression, but I may be wrong.
Luis,
The question
okay.
is what we prefer. Do we prefer a
Luis,
new deal that includes the missiles, or you want to include also Iran's destabilizing activities and then kill the entire deal?
Luis, as the moderator here, I want to step in. We're running out of time, and we have a student in our midst who asked a question, and I want to get his question out. But I also want to combine a couple questions because we are running out of time, and I want to be sensitive to your time, the panelists' time, and the attendees. So we have a student from Kaiser University here in West Palm, and he told us how to pronounce his name. I'm going to mess it up again, but I pronounce it like we might in Israel. Ha'akon, how's that? That's his first name. He's asking, he says, an excellent panel. As I watch the normalization of relations between Netanyahu's Israel and the countries in the Middle East, I fear that these deals are mostly among the governments and not among the civil society. I also fear that the deals are pushed forward by primarily economical and personal interest rather than a goal of peace, especially as Netanyahu is under a lot of pressure domestically. What are your thoughts on this? I just want to throw out a second question. You can talk about that, but I have a question here. How do you view Erdogan's criticism of the Biden appointment of McGurk as the NSC Mideast coordinator?
Stephen, let me jump in just a little bit. I'll answer the question, but I want to answer also Louis, just for 1 minute. Louis, I said limit to Iran what can do, not that Iran's behavior is not spoiling. Iran has completely spoiling behavior in the region, but there is a limit to what Iran can do, especially now. And also, when you want to look at Iran's behavior in the region, you cannot isolate Iran's behavior from the history of the Arab-Iranians relationship, especially during the Iran-Iraq war, Louis. This is extremely important. So don't leave that variable out. Since I mentioned that, let me go ahead and speak about the Abraham Accord. And since he said mainly about, personal and economic, we tend to forget, and this is where I'm gonna echo what Yossi said, Elsie. We tend to forget, Israel's, especially Mossad's, let me repeat that again, Mossad's, operation, activities, work, hard work in the Middle East that goes back to Yemen and to Oman. And I mentioned that probably with you in Yemen for quite some times, in the 1960s, in Oman in the 1970s. This is where Israel started to be active, especially the Mossad, and more so the Mossad plus the foreign ministry, because the Mossad works under the supervision of the prime minister. They worked so hard from 1990 to now. So mainly it's not only personal. You have a lot of work that took place, not only recent. So of course the Arabs, at the end of the day, and I see many of them, especially from the Arab Gulf, they look, listen, where did Israel hurt us? Really, show me an Arab countries that fought Israel from the Gulf. Where? Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, so there is, when we speak about the Arab-Israeli conflict, yes, the Arab Gulf supported, but something happened in 1990s that was a breaking point when Yasser Arafat supported Iraq. Finish. It's a tribal mentality. They will never forgive the Palestinian leadership. This is it. And more so, as a matter of fact, what brought those people together, those countries, is just our geostrategic interest. So you have geostrategic interest and people that said, listen, where are we going? Israel is next door. United States is going to China. So we hear now what us, and of course now you have many people saying we come from the same clothes. We come from the Abrahamic tradition. So this is where the gentleman, I answered him. It's geostrategic, and it took a lot of hard work. Nothing comes out from a vacuum in the Middle East. You have a lot of work that puts out by the intelligence and by Israel Foreign Ministry, and I give them really, I tip my hat for them.
Absolutely right. Very, very, very briefly to Hakon. It's a good question, but Hakon, look, We have had peace with Egypt for 40 years, not with civic society, but with Egypt. It has maintained itself, you know. And all these terms that we use in the Western world about civic society, I don't know exactly what you mean by civic society in the UAE or in other countries like that, you know, or in Syria for that matter, not that you mentioned Syria. It's very important to understand that what we have achieved now is something which is part of a process, as Robert said, that has started years ago. And it reflects something that the Arabs have wanted. Nothing was forced upon them, and Israel could not force anything upon them, nor did Americans force upon them. It's a question of a meeting of circumstances, and in diplomacy, timing is 50% of everything. So the timing was properly exploited by the Israelis and the Trump administration, I should say, and therefore it worked well. But we'll see how it all develops. The very last point about Iran and the missiles and all this. Yes, we can't expect that the Iranians will give up on every demand and that the Israelis through the Americans will achieve everything they want from Iran. But in general terms, I think that Robert is right. The Iranians are coming very close to the end of their abilities. And therefore, we need to take that into account and to know on what issues to put more or less pressure on them. I believe that they are the weaker side right now. It will be a terrible and tragic mistake for the Biden administration not to realize that and to do things that will be the total opposite of Trump only because they want to be the total opposite of Trump.
Yeah. I just I agree with the student. I think relations between civil society is extremely important, and I mentioned that in my presentation. Egypt and Jordan present a very good example of what shouldn't be done. In Egypt, it was the government of Hosni Mubarak that basically prevented relations between Israelis and Egyptians, okay, at all levels, whether it is academic, whether it is commercial, whether it is tourism, whether it is whatever. In Jordan was not the government actually was pro-relations, but it was precisely civil society became the problem. Why? Because more than 50% of the Jordanian population is Palestinians, and there was opposition from the trade unions and from the professional associations and the Association of Dentists, and I don't know what else. They all oppose relations with Israel. Only the government of King Hussein and then his son, Abdallah, supported the relation with Israel. So yes, I think in the case of the Persian Gulf countries that just normalize relations with Israel, I think there is room for developing relations between civil societies. And we are seeing already tourists, Israeli tourists, actually going to Dubai and to the United Arab Emirates. Some of them actually get in trouble when they return to Israel because of the COVID-19, but that's a different story. But yes, I think it is important, and I think the student from Kaiser is right on target. Very important. Don't leave everything to governments.
Thank you, Luis. We're running late, and I would like to say that I would like to call this part 1 of 2, because we can go on forever. And knowing Dr. Rabiel and Dr. Olmert and Dr. Fleischman as well as I do, I have a funny feeling we'll agree to that further down the road to come back for part 2.
Absolutely.
So if you didn't have a chance to participate as much as you would like, stay tuned. I can tell you that it's a learning experience for me when I listen to these 3 guys talk about what's going on in the Middle East. And I know for most of you, you get the same sort of education and excitement about it as I do. So I want to thank Dr. Rabiel, Dr. Olmert, Dr. Fleischman for your expert analysis, almost like being a fly on the wall and listening to the true experts. And I'd like to end by saying that the center is a 501c3 nonprofit. Please visit our website. Again, as I said earlier, at palmbeachdemocracy.org, and click on the donation button. Your tax-deductible donation will allow us to continue to build a strong presence in Florida, the US, and throughout the world. And with that, I once again thank you all for attending. We would be nothing without our attendees. So I thank you all. And
Shabbat shalom to all
Thank
of
you,
you.
Yossi. Thank you,
Shabbat
Yossi. Thank
shalom,
you,
and have
everybody.
a wonderful
Have
weekend.
a wonderful weekend and a healthy
Thank
weekend.
you. You
Thank
too,
you
you
all.
guys, you too, you all.
Joy, thank you.